2013, o então integrante da Agência de Segurança Nacional Americana, a NSA, Edward Snowden, surpreendeu o mundo ao revelar que o órgão espionava governos de outros países e e-mails de milhões de cidadãos. Quem entrevistou Snowden naquela época foi o jornalista, também americano, Glenn Greenwald, que trabalhava no jornal inglês The Guardian. Greenwald, que ganhou os prêmios Pulitzer e ESSO de jornalismo pela reportagem, deixou o jornal para criar o site The Intercept, que faz muitas reportagens críticas à mídia brasileira. Neste Ponto de Vista, edição especial Bienal do Livro de Brasília, conversamos com ele sobre o acesso à informação e mídia e democracia. Você acompanha a entrevista agora. Hello, Mr. Greenwald. We are here at Ponto de Vista, and I'd like to start asking you about The Intercept, your site. When we open The Intercept, we see many stories about Brazil that we just don't see here in our newspapers. Would you say that the site has a clear leftist position, or would you say that it's only as political as it should be?
I wouldn't say that the site actually has a left-wing bias or a left-wing perspective. I think instead we have a very clear idea about journalism that we think should shape what we do much more than our views about politics. So we have on our staff, and we'll continue to have on our staff, journalists and editors with a really wide range of different political perspectives. But what bonds us together is the idea that journalism should be about being an oppositional force against people who wield power, whether it be political and economic power, and especially against ideas that have become orthodoxy and gained widespread acceptance in the mainstream that haven't had enough criticism or pushback. And so I think if you look at the strain of articles there, including our stories about impeachment, it has nothing to do with any allegiance to a party. There are lots of people who are very opposed to impeachment, including myself, who find very fundamental problems with PT. I think instead the idea is defending certain journalistic and political values, whether it be democracy or the need to have diversity of opinions or the need to have critical thought against those who wield the greatest influence.
The Intercept and the Brazilian editions of El País and BBC usually offer these critic views, especially about the government of President Michel Temer, our president nowadays. Would you say that the approach of our media, the Brazilian media, is the approach that it should be taken, or is it not critical enough of this government nowadays?
No, I think the dominant media here in Brazil is fundamentally corrupted and fundamentally broken. And I would say that what led to the creation of The Intercept Brazil, as well as probably the creation of BBC Brazil and Huffington Post Brazil and BuzzFeed Brazil, was this observation that you have a tiny number of extremely rich families who own virtually all of the dominant media outlets here in Brazil, especially when there's a political crisis like there was with impeachment. They tend to unify so that they are more or less disseminating exactly the same opinions, exactly the same perspectives, and exactly the same information. And it was my reporting on impeachment that led me, even though I've lived in Brazil for 11 years, to really realize for the first time just how acute the journalistic crisis in Brazil was, because I think that more than any other time, at least in the last, say, decade, you saw how extreme the Brazilian media was willing to go in removing themselves from their journalistic function and becoming essentially a leading political actor trying to foster a particular result using the control of information that they wielded. And it isn't just me who said that. Well, I think the most important event of the last year, if you want to understand journalism in Brazil, was when the world-respected Freedom of Press Foundation group, Reporters Without Borders, issued their yearly ranking of press freedom for all countries in the world, and Brazil dropped to 104th in the world for press liberties. And the organization said it was in part because of violence directed against journalists, but it was also in large part because of the way in which the dominant Brazilian media conducted itself during the impeachment crisis in trying to remove a democratically elected president for their own interests, and acting not as journalists but as political actors, and that this was actually a threat to press freedoms and to basic liberties. And they very rarely issue those kind of statements, but did in that case because they saw what I saw, which is that I don't think there are many countries in which the media conducts itself the way that it conducts itself here in Brazil.
The media of the so-called first world usually takes a side, politically speaking. It makes it clear for the readers in which side they are, if they are pro-government, they are against the government, and in elections, if they are pro one candidate or against the other. Here in Brazil, it doesn't happen usually. So which way do you think is the more fair to the public?
Well, interestingly, I think you find the model that you described more in Europe than, say, in the United States, where in the United States, especially with old media, there still is this attempt to pretend that they're neutral. But I've actually, and I think you're right, I think in Brazil, there's this attitude of it's so important that we never take any side. And I think actually the Brazilian model shows just how farcical and how fraudulent and how deceptive that mentality is, because as human beings, we are not computers. We don't perceive the world objectively through numbers. We perceive it subjectively through all kinds of biases and prism, whether it be nationalistic or socioeconomic or race or class or whatever subjective experiences you have. And so the question for me never is this journalist one with opinions, and is this journalist one who doesn't have opinions? Because human beings don't float above opinions.
They all have opinions.
They all have opinions. And so the question becomes, are you a journalist who's honest with your readers and viewers about the opinions you have? Or do you try and trick them and deceive them into pretending that you're something that you're not? And so for me, the model is much more honest when you're open about the perspectives you have. Journalism is much more vibrant and truthful. And I don't think anybody in this country that has ever watched Jornal Nacional believes that Brazilian journalists are neutral when it comes to leading debates. It's a joke, and it destroys the credibility of the media.
You think Brazilians don't notice it?
No, I think Brazilians do notice it. I don't think anyone believes that. And I think the reason they have so little credibility is precisely because when you look into the camera or you write in a newspaper something that everybody knows is false, which is, I have no opinions, I'm objective, I'm neutral, I'm not on anyone's side, people lose credibility, you lose faith in what you're saying when they know that what you're telling them is false.
Bom, vamos fazer agora pequeno intervalo e voltamos em 1 minuto. Estamos de volta com o ponto de vista aqui da terceira Bienal do Livro de Brasília, em que a gente está entrevistando o jornalista e escritor Greenwald. Glenn, so let's talk about something else. What you're doing here. Democracy and the media is the subject of your presentation here at Bienal. What's necessary for the media to be more democratic than it is nowadays?
I think the democratization of media, both in Brazil and globally, is essentially inevitable, which is the really good news, because we were talking earlier about how Brazilian media is owned and controlled by a tiny number of extremely wealthy factions, industrial families, and that has enabled them to maintain a stranglehold on the flow of information. And the internet, in all sorts of ways, is eroding that control. One important way is that it's opening up voices so that it's very easy when you sign onto the internet. It's just as easy to type in O Globo or Folha as it is The Guardian or the BBC or the New York Times or international outlets. And so automatically the internet is just a window into a wider range of political opinions and perspectives than was ever possible before, when people had to wait for a newspaper to arrive on their doorstep or a television satellite to transmit signals to their TV. But I think the more important aspect of the way the internet is bringing about this democratization is that, you know, when I started writing as a journalist, it was only 10 or 11 years ago, and I was able very quickly to have an audience of 20,000 people, and then 40,000 people, and then 80,000 people, and I was spending no money to do it. I just created a free blog, and I started writing on my blog, and it attracted attention. And the fact that you can reach a huge audience now without spending any money is a major change in terms of who can now transmit and communicate information around the world, because you don't have to buy a TV station, you don't need TV cameras or satellites, you don't need a printing press, you essentially just need a computer and access to the internet. And this has really diversified the kind of political dialogue that we're having, the kind of news that's being reported in ways that I don't think we've quite begun to really comprehend.
Do you think the public media helps to democratize the media in general too?
I think public media here in Brazil, I think in other places too, a little bit in the United States, a lot in places in Europe, like the UK, has been critical for diversifying and democratizing, because it removes the media and journalism from capitalistic pressures and from the need for huge amounts of private capital, which means that automatically it's diversifying the way in which news can get reported.
Okay, let's come back in time a little bit and talk about the recent past. You were the journalist who broke to the world that the NSA had secret programs of surveillance of the US citizens. How did you first meet Edward Snowden, and how did he make contact with you?
So in December of 2012, I was working in my house in Rio de Janeiro, and I got an email from somebody who was anonymous at the time. He was using the name Cincinnatus, which was a name of an old Roman emperor, who emailed me and said that he had some extremely important information that he wanted to give me, but he was very afraid.
You were working for The Guardian?
I was at The Guardian, but he said he was afraid of speaking to me over email that wasn't protected by encryption, and so he wanted me to install a whole bunch of encryption so that we could speak securely, because he knew at the time, although I didn't, the full extent of electronic surveillance and knew exactly why it was so dangerous. So it took us a while to sort of do that dance.
How long?
It was about 6 to 7 weeks of just going back and forth, because, you know, as a journalist, as I'm sure you know, it's very common to hear from people claiming they have a huge story that they want to give you, and 99% of the time it's the byproduct of delusions or a little bit of insanity. Well, you know, you never want to dismiss it exactly, because in the 1% of those cases it can be an Edward Snowden. But at the same time, you don't just drop everything that you're doing. You know, if you're a busy journalist, I was working on a lot of stories. I wasn't going to just drop what I was doing and start playing games with encryption because somebody I didn't know was demanding that I do so. So it just took a long time for him to convince me that it was worthwhile. And he finally went to a colleague of mine, the documentary filmmaker Laura Poitras, and he kind of went to her and said, she was already using encryption, and said, please help Glenn get set up so that we could speak. And so the three of us started communicating that way, and that was essentially how we began working together.
Okay. Here in Brazil, you gave an interview in 2013 saying that the NSA was spying on Petrobras to the benefit of Americans, and also that President Dilma was being spied by the American government that caused a huge diplomatic incident and gave you important prizes too, right? It was the confirmation, but in some ways, the world always knew the power of surveillance that the US had, right?
First of all, I think there's a big difference between suspecting that something is happening and getting confirmation. Because while you suspect it, if you don't have the evidence for it, there's something in the back of your mind that tells you that maybe it's not true, that maybe you're being paranoid, that maybe this is just a conspiracy. There's nothing to grab onto. It just sort of sits as a suspicion. So I think it's a major transformation for this information to go from something you suspect to something that you know. But I think beyond that, yes, I do think that everybody was aware that Americans had serious surveillance technology. Osama bin Laden very famously wouldn't communicate with anybody using the computer or telephone. He would only communicate with personal courier because he knew that the Americans had developed very potent surveillance technology. But nobody, I think, understood the scope of it. The fact that every single day they were collecting billions of emails and telephone calls, that they were reaching not into the depths of Al-Qaeda, but economic institutions, government and diplomatic agencies, trade negotiations, things that had nothing to do with terrorism, everything for economic advantage or diplomatic power or just control over populations, entire populations of democratic countries, hundreds of millions of people subjected to daily invasive surveillance. I don't think that even those of us like myself who had been working on this for a long time and had large suspicions that they were doing lots of troubling things, had any idea of the full scope, not just of their activities, but also their ambitions. And so, yeah, I think that was actually new and shocking for a lot of people.
Do you think anything changed after all those stories, after Snowden? Do you think there is a pre-Snowden and post-Snowden?
Yeah, there's huge fundamental changes. Sometimes people ask me that, and what they mean is, oh, look, the NSA is still up and running, the building didn't collapse, they haven't closed their doors, so it doesn't seem like anything changed, they're still doing their spying. And they are still doing their spying. There's been some laws passed in a lot of countries, including the US, that limits it a little bit. But the much bigger changes are the fact that individuals around the world are now aware of the extent to which their privacy is being compromised. So they're using encryption, which builds a wall between their activities online and what the government can see. But the more important change is the fact that internet companies are now understanding that they need to demonstrate to their users that they will protect their users' privacy and not turn it over to the governments. And that's why you see companies like Facebook and WhatsApp now offering end-to-end encryption where they can't even access the information even if the government orders them to. And of course, here in Brazil, we've seen courts order WhatsApp shut down on 3 different occasions, or maybe 4 now, because the position of WhatsApp is we can't break through this wall of encryption. And you see the same thing happening with Google, the same thing happening with Microsoft and Yahoo. And so it is a real barrier now that has been erected by these tech companies precisely because their users have demanded it as a result of the Snowden revelations, and that's a huge change.
Yeah, Snowden is still outside of the US, protected. Do you consider yourself a persona non grata in your own country, in the United States, sometimes, or by some groups?
I mean, for the first year of doing the reporting, I didn't leave Brazil, in large part because my government was being very threatening, that if I did leave Brazil, if I tried to return to the US, I could be arrested. And we were never sure if those threats were real, but when the US government is threatening you, you take it seriously. And then when I finally was able to go back, we went back, Laura and I jointly, in order to, the week of the Pulitzers were being announced, and we felt like it would be difficult for them to put us in jail if we were winning the Pulitzer. Once I was able to go back, I've been able to go back continually. There's certainly, the work is very controversial in the US. A lot of people regard not just Snowden, but myself as a traitor. But at the same time, the work I do gets a lot of attention. I'm able to go on television. I'm able to write books. And so I still have a big platform in the US. And so no, I don't feel persona non grata, but I definitely am aware that there are a lot of people very angry about the reporting that we did.
Thank you so much.
Great to talk to you.
I hope we can meet some other time to talk more about all of those questions, but our time is up. Thank you so much.
Great to be with you.
Chegamos ao fim de mais um Ponto de Vista. Você pode conferir esta e outras entrevistas em câmara.leg.br/ponto de vista. Até a próxima.